Hello from Free University of Berlin and welcome to History on Tape, where we sit down with historians to talk about their work and ideas. My guest today is the chair of Department of History at Harvard University, but he has crossed the Atlantic to come to Berlin. This is not the first time he has crossed the Atlantic in both his life and his work that covers the British Empire, the United States, and the broader world in general. Today we will be talking about his book, The Declaration of Independence, A Global History, an upcoming book, Civil Wars, A History in Ideas, and another exciting book that he has that we'll talk about during the conversation. Professor David Armitage, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So, how does it happen that someone from Britain ends up studying the broader Atlantic world? What drew you to that?
I think we see now in the contemporary world a relationship between movement and imagination, and that certainly happened to me. I was lucky enough in the middle of my PhD to get a fellowship to go to the United States, and found that very act of mobility, of shifting across the Atlantic for study, shifted the boundaries of my own imagination as a historian, and I never really looked back from that moment.
Now, in your work, you are a practitioner of intellectual history and also global history, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But in one of your other books, Foundations of Modern International Thought, you talk about the paucity of the intellectual history, how there hasn't been enough attention to it, and I think you say in relation to the social turn that happened to the history that it had become that what a philosopher told to another was as unfashionable as what a clerk said to another. So why intellectual history? Why does it matter to approach history in that way?
I think our whole world is shaped by the images, but also the language that we use to describe that world to ourselves, but also to project our own view of the world to other people, to persuade them of our point of view, to engage in conversation, to try and understand the world together. And I think as a historian, my main aim has been precisely to understand the ways in which people in the past used language, in particular political language, to understand the world they inhabited. And I became particularly interested over time in the ways in which people understood their world, not as working within the boundaries of a single community, but also simultaneously operating within the relations between multiple communities. And the term of art that we now use for that is international thought. That is how people came to think about their world as a world of different communities, overlapping, interlocking, sometimes in conflict with each other. And the quotation that you just gave about the paucity of ideas was in fact a quotation from about 50 years ago by an international relations theorist who said there was a paucity of thinking about international relations in a historical manner, or the history of the ways in which people thought about the relations between their communities. And when I read that famous phrase, I thought, that's right. I mean, I've always felt that, and it crystallized a project for me and indeed for quite a lot of other people in the last 10 years to understand, in particular, the origins of our world of states. If we go back even 100 years, there were maybe 50 political units that we could recognize as states in the world. Now, every part of the world is claimed by a state, the territory is covered by a state. The most unfortunate people in the world are refugees or stateless people who would like to be under the protection of a state. That's clearly a relatively recent development, and it seems to me, both as an intellectual historian but also a global historian, asking how our world, this world of states, emerged, is to ask about a collective feat of political imagination to reimagine the world in these international terms.
But so delving into your book, which is an example of an intellectual history as well, about the Declaration of Independence, one of the things that might come up is that you, for example, refer to the logic of Thomas Jefferson and to the importance that this text has in both establishing the American independence and then the global consequence of it that you follow until basically not too long ago, and the independence that happened in independences that happened from 90 to 1990 to 93 for post-Soviet countries and whatnot. Wouldn't some people say that, to talk about that independence, to talk about the establishment of facts, isn't it more important to talk about armies, to talk about material things that led to that? Aren't you sort of over-privileging the ideas or the logic of Jefferson or the genius of people who wrote a single document?
That's a response I've often had. It's a response intellectual historians often get, to which we and I often reply, well, why were people motivated to join armies? Why were people motivated, for instance, in the case of the American Revolution, to claim independence, to fight for independence? There may have been material, physical, financial motives for doing that, but there were also ideas, imaginations, arguments, sometimes quite violent arguments around ideas which drove people to take up arms. And so, as some historians have said, to consider materiality without ideas is to consider a body without a mind, just as I think it would also be true to say to think about ideas without the material circumstances around them would be to consider the mind without the body, to write, as some intellectual historians have, a kind of history from the neck up. I think these two things must be integrated to understand both the motivations which drove people to war, to independence, to fighting, but the arguments that animated them are the substance of history as much as the battles that were fought in the literal sense on the battlefields as well.
But it's not only the ideas that you discuss. I mean, ideas exist in all fields of life. But actually, to talk a bit more about the substance of the book, one way that I would put it is that there's a lot of Vattel but no Voltaire. For instance, I mean, you talk about the legal history, how important it was that the Declaration of Independence was framed, in the legal sense. It's focused on natural law, its effect on international relations history, but not, for instance, of the, as I said, you don't really talk a lot about the French. I mean, you do talk about it, but it seems to be not as important. But the French tradition, or there's a lot of emphasis put on the law and on the legal ideas. Is that also justified?
Oh, I think so, and that was certainly one of the revisionist aspects of my work on the Declaration of Independence, was to insist that the Declaration of Independence, the US Declaration of Independence, was not simply a document of domestic politics, as it's really always been treated by Americans themselves, as they see it as an icon of their Americanness, but to try and understand how it would have been received, how it was written, what language informed it, what genres informed it in the 18th century itself. And it becomes, I believe, blindingly obvious once you put it in its context of 1776 that the Declaration of Independence was first and foremost a declaration of interdependence. It was a declaration that is a proclamation to a wider world that these United States, 13 of them at that point, had joined what we would now call the international community. It was an announcement both to the population of the former colonies that had become states that they were now united as a body facing outwards in the world, but just as importantly, perhaps even more importantly, this was a document addressed to the other powers of the earth, as the Declaration puts it, to show that the United States were now open for business and also open to alliances. And the language of those powers of the earth was the language of what we would now call international law. And once you look at the context of international law, or as they would have said at the time, the law of nations, you realize very quickly that the language of the Declaration of Independence is exactly that language. It's legal language, but it's the language of the law of nations, and it's the language of the character you just mentioned, Vattel, more than it's the language of Voltaire or of John Locke, for instance, who's often taken to be one of the founding fathers, one of the major inspirations for the Declaration of Independence. And in fact, just to give one key element in the story, the only book that we can absolutely guarantee was on the desk of the members of Congress when they were writing and drafting and revising the Declaration of Independence was Vattel's book, no other work. And I often like to say that Vattel is the most important, globally important 18th century thinker of whom nobody else has ever heard. But he was hugely influential in the 18th century, and indeed we know that Benjamin Franklin bought a copy of his book, sent it back to Congress, and that was on Thomas Jefferson's desk. And the words free and independent as in free and independent states, which formed the very climax of the Declaration of Independence, are something like a leitmotif in Vattel's work, and it's very clear that those words came from Vattel because this was a document that spoke the language of the law of nations, of international laws, we'd now say, to a wider community, including France, the country, obviously, of Voltaire.
To pursue the same line of questioning, maybe to help us understand, what is the foundations of the international legal regime, which, as a historian, you can find out throughout history. A sort of a skeptical person would say that since there is no, authority, there is no worldwide authority in, we usually know law, domestic law, as, we associated with police, with the law enforcement, basically. Since there is no international law enforcement, is international law, to sort of take a funny position, is like, some people would say it's just a term of phrase, like, the way people put it, like how important would it have been if the United States didn't have the ships and the economic power and to defend its independence? Would it have mattered, how they formulated it legally?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the two things are connected with each other, and you can't extricate the one from the other. That might does not make right unless you can justify and explain and persuade other people of the rightness of your cause. Conversely, to have right on one side in a case of international warfare, what we might call in this case post-colonial or anti-imperial warfare in the case of the American Revolution, you also need the power of armies, of diplomacy, of international finance behind you as well. So certainly it would be foolish to argue that it was impossible to imagine the success of the American Revolution without the success of the American Revolutionary armies at Yorktown, for instance. And certainly the Declaration of Independence became more thinkable after the success of the Patriot forces at the Battle of Saratoga, for instance. But these two things are two sides of the same coin. You have to have external justifications, legal justifications, to persuade both the doubters in your own community that what they're doing is right, and to justify your actions to the outside world. But in the absence of as we would now say, facts on the ground, that can be rather vain. But it's the conjunction of the two which I think is tremendously important and significant in every modern revolution, that ideas and military and other kinds of revolutionary action go hand in hand with each other. They really are inextricable. Maybe that's what distinguishes modern revolutions, is they're revolutions both of ideas and of arms, one might say.
The last thing I want to ask about the book, and then we can get to some of your other work, is that, in your own words, there's a claim in the book and a chapter that sees, you say that to give it a global history of the Declaration of Independence is an sort of economic way of giving history of states. You see like the foundation of states in general as passed upon that, and then you go through a global history, as I said earlier, following to our own time. You sort of see the afterlife of this Declaration of Independence, and you bring many examples. But in your own words, what was this afterlife? Well, how can you link the general growth of states in the world to this document?
Mm-hmm. Well, just to pick that apart very slightly, I had two aims in the book, or the latter part of the book, tracing the afterlives of the Declaration of Independence. One was a very modest one, to see what use had been made of this document and how it established a genre, a political genre, a legal genre, an international genre, which other peoples, nations, states could use to explain and to justify their eruption into an existing world of other states, all the powers of the earth. A broader aim, which was not my initial goal, but became one of the intentions of the book, was to use the more than 100, I think I counted something like 120 declarations of independence that I'd found, to use that series of documents as a kind of trace for a much larger process, which I think had been overlooked by historians, which was exactly this process of the blanketing of the earth with these strange and novel objects we call states, which almost all of us inhabit now. And that seemed to me a very big question in global history. How did we come to inhabit a world of states? Which at the very least I could hint at by tracing the spread of these documents, which were precisely about announcing new states. And so seeing transitions, often but not always transitions from empires to states, or sometimes federations to states, would at least provide one way into cracking open that much bigger problem of the emergence of the world of states that we all now inhabit, a world, coming back to your earlier question, of domestic law, but a world also in which the states themselves began to cooperate and negotiate to build up a body of customary law, recognizable rules that we now call international law, which may not have the force of a sovereign authority in the way that domestic law does, but is still in some important ways binding upon actors, both individual and corporate, in the international sphere to this day.
Yeah, but on the same vein, you do the spread of nationalist states has been discussed a lot. But quoting Gellner, you specifically point out that is not the nation state that's really at stake. That's perhaps a kind of new idea, but states, and as you just defended. But how is the French state of Louis XV not a state, and then the French state of today? Like, in what way that state is not a state, but the French state today is, or the German state today?
Well, I certainly wouldn't argue that the French state of Louis XIV or XV or XVI was not a state. That clearly was, and even, that was recognizable even to the authors of the Declaration of Independence when they appealed to the powers of the earth. The key power of the earth they were appealing to was precisely the French state and its military and financial and diplomatic might at that moment. But to think of other examples, the Belgian state, the Italian state, the German state, one could go on and on and on. None of those existed in 1776 or 1800 or 1815, for instance. And a lot of the states that we see now, those that emerged from the post-Soviet collapse, or re-emerged in many cases from the post-Soviet collapse, those that emerged or re-emerged from the breakup of Yugoslavia, a state like South Sudan, one of the most recent declarations of independence, which emerged from civil war and secession in the case of Sudan, for instance. One could go on and on and on. Very few of these states pre-existed the period of the American Revolution, for instance, and in many cases, over 100 cases, they emerged over the course of the 20th century, and that seemed to me, and it seemed to other historians as well, to be a story worth telling, but not as a teleological story. I think that's something very important to point out. We now know a lot more about the alternative forms of political organization which sat, as it were, between the poles of empires and states, federations, various other kinds of composite unions, redistributions of authority at the federal or the confederal level, the range of political imagination into which people could organize their communities is much larger than nationalist historiography would lead us to believe. And nationalist historiography has duped most of us into thinking there is a natural relationship between nations on the one hand and states on the other. Every nation should become a state, and every state should contain a nation. That's the nationalist equation, but it's contingent, it's recent, and in many cases historically it is utterly false.
But to clarify the question there is that, my question is that it seems to me that we've always had states. The governance has been done by a state or state-like bodies. So is it, by that do we mean that the consolidation of the world into a fewer number of states, so that we have less than 200 that govern the whole world? Is that what's at stake? And, so the collapse of the empires, or, if that's the answer, is that not basically the national state that sort of we have today?
Well, we have to distinguish between different forms of the object that we might call, in Weberian terms, a state. If by a state you mean, again, to use Weber's famous definitions, a an authority which can claim a monopoly of violence over a territory, that just as easily describes most of the polities that we call empires as it does those that we call states, but we still distinguish conceptually and practically and pragmatically between empires and states, and I think that's very important to do, as well as the other forms of distributed authority or layered authority which have distinguished most forms of political organization over most of the earth for most of the time. So in general speech, and I think this is true of most social scientists and until recently many historians, when we talk about the state, we endow it with those Weberian characteristics, and we assume that the state is something which is different, for instance, from an empire. So it would be relatively rare to say that the British Empire or the Roman Empire was a state, except in metaphorical terms. And I think that distinction is an important one for us, again, to understand the dimensions of political development over the longue durée, over at least 2,000 years, and not to use the term state as a trans-historical, transportable, mobile concept, but one that's actually deeply rooted in particular sets of histories and may not be applicable or may not have been applicable until relatively recently to large parts of the world or large segments of the world's populations who lived under very different kinds of political orders, which again could only metaphorically be called states. And just as a tiny sidebar to all of that, we should also distinguish between states in the sense of those controlling authorities which had cognizance and legal authority over populations within territories on the one hand, and then states as those objects which interact with each other in an international realm, or we might say more accurately an interstate realm as well. Those two dimensions are obviously linked with each other, but they have to be distinguished with each other from each other in terms of their historical developments.
Absolutely. Well, many more interesting ideas in this book, but hopefully we can get to them later. But let's go to your next book, actually, that is not here yet. A book that is, I repeat the name, Civil Wars, A History in Ideas. I think the very name relates to some of the things we talked about. Tell us a little bit about this book. It's not a history of civil wars in the sense of, naming all the civil wars that have ever happened, I suppose. It's a history in ideas.
Yes, it's certainly not an encyclopedia of everything that's been called a civil war, but that would be utterly unreadable as well as unwritable by one person, so I had no ambition to do that. But I think of it as the sequel to the book on the Declaration of Independence. That book on the Declaration of Independence was about state-making, about the process of state-making, using the origins of the United States as a key example of that, and then tracing that process through history since the late 18th century. So that book was about state-making. The new book is about state breaking. What happens when communities fissure? How do people talk about that? What resources do they have for imagining that, for dealing with the horror that ensues from that breakup or internal division within an existing community? And I wanted to treat this again as an intellectual history, in this case what I've called a history in ideas. And just to explain that very briefly, I'm distinguishing it from the classic history of ideas associated with great historians like Arthur Lovejoy in the middle of the 20th century in the United States, for whom ideas could often appear as disembodied objects, independent of the agents or the individuals who used them, engaged in some kind of platonic or metaphysical conversation in the clouds, far above the material world or the interactions of human beings. I didn't want to suggest that in my treatment, and so I coined this term history in ideas to suggest that what I was trying to do was to tell a longue durée history, in the case of this book, over 2,000 years or more, by looking at the ways in which ideas had been used in arguments over the naming, the framing, the description, and the experience of the division of human communities in order to pull together some of the continuities in the ways in which people have thought about that most horrifying and destructive form of internal division over the centuries, indeed over the millennia, and then also to find the points at which innovation had taken place in the imagining of civil war as a concept or as a family of concepts over time.
I'm listening to some of your talks on the topic before in the past few years. That the last one was just a couple of weeks ago in Berlin, but I mean you've spoken about this topic before. It strikes one that you do talk a lot about the legal definitions, the political scientist definition. My question is, as a historian, do you take your terms of analysis, your units of analysis, basically similar to those that are in law, or not, and why is that?
I'm not trying to write a book as if I were a lawyer or a political scientist. I'm writing it as an historian to look at the ways in which the language of the contemporary social sciences, the language of law or jurisprudence has been layered into a centuries or again millennia long set of arguments and debates about the meaning, the nature, the boundaries, the form, the consequences of civil war itself. So very briefly, what I try to do is to show the gap between what I call vernacular understandings of civil war, that is the experience of civil war of those on the ground who are drawn into or thrown into civil war on the one hand, and again what I call expert understandings of civil war. So a good example that I use in the book is that of the what we now call the Syrian civil war, which began in late 2011, began really to ramp up in the early parts of 2012. At that point, there were lots of reports from Syria itself of people saying, we're in the midst of a civil war, our families are being torn apart, this is not just resistance on the one side versus tyranny on the other, this is something much bigger, much more horrifying than that. But it took until the summer of 2012, that is almost a year into the conflict, by the time 17,000 people had already died by the best estimates of the casualty rates, that any international body, in this case the International Committee of the Red Cross, said officially and formally what we have here in Syria is a civil war, or to use the technical language of those communities, a non-international armed conflict. And I'm very interested in that gap of time, that gap of experience, that gap of understanding, and I want to excavate in the book how did we come to a place where we don't believe the people on the ground when they say we're experiencing a civil war, but we have to wait months and sometimes years for international organs, whether it's the Red Cross, the UN, the World Bank, various agencies, non-governmental or international governmental organizations, to talk about a conflict in those terms. And so what I've attempted in the book is a genealogy of the ways in which law and the social sciences have been layered over understandings derived from history, from experience, in some cases from poetry, for instance, imaginative literature, into different conceptions of these conflicts, which then come into collision with each other in our contemporary discourse about them.
Yeah, and this is a very interesting turn, sort of in terms of methodology and different things, is that, for instance, in the old Marxist language, it was always said that every revolution is basically a civil war of classes. I mean, it is in Marxist literature, this sort of is used a lot. When people on the ground say they're in a civil war, or sometimes that they are not in a war, they often are trying to make legal claims, as we've seen with the notorious word genocide, that, its application, it seems to me that it has, for a historian, there is no way of, scientifically certifying whether something is a genocide or not, because the word has become so legally charged. Mm-hmm. So that's my question, for you as a historian who follows how, lawyers and legal systems and people use the civil war, it's something, but can you as a historian say that civil war is distinguished by these characters from this many other imaginative terms that we have come up with, strife, conflict, revolution? So the question is, if as a historian you can distinguish civil war, is there like a historically justifiable threshold that you have to pass to get to this civil war?
Well, my own aims are much more modest than that. I'm not trying, for instance, to come up with a new or better definition of civil war, which could clarify the bright line according to which side a conflict might be on, one or the other, whether a threshold has been crossed. I am extremely interested in the ways in which that attempt to draw bright lines, to give clear definitions, to set particular metrics has been attempted and almost always failed in the past. So my own modest effort is to raise the consciousness of those in the legal community, in NGOs, in the international political community, for instance, to raise consciousness about the occasional immodesty of their use of bright lines and clear metrics. The attempt of the book is precisely to show that civil war and its analogues like non-international armed conflict have often been as touchy and as dangerous and as polemical as terms like genocide, very good example that you've chosen, or coup d'etat, for instance. These are all highly political and ideological terms. We've tended to assume that, for instance, civil war is somehow natural or could be naturalized, that it is an almost eternal condition of human beings to fight each other. Think of all of the myths, whether it's Cain and Abel or Arjuna and Krishna. I mean, many different traditions have fratricidal conflicts at their very beginnings. Romulus and Remus in the Roman tradition would be another one. So there's been an assumption in philosophy, and I think in general understandings, that as violent Hobbesian creatures, we're always at each other's throats. Civil war is the natural condition of human beings, which we revert to when the brittle veneer of politics and civility cracks. I'm arguing very strongly against that, to say that civil war, as we now understand it, is a relatively recent invention, that it is not a natural condition of human beings, that we should be extremely cautious about trying to be too precise about it, as social scientists, particularly political scientists, sometimes are, using definitions based on the number of battle deaths within a particular period over a particular territory, for instance, and then saying that what was happening in Iraq in the aftermath of the US invasion couldn't have been a civil war because it didn't meet these very precise criteria. Only 997 people had died that year, and it hadn't reached 1,000, so therefore it wasn't a civil war. I think that's both absurd and, more importantly, dangerous. So my aim is not to come up with a better definition, but to show the fragility and the contestability of all definitions, so that we might handle them with more care, but also, more importantly, listen more closely to those on the ground who say there's not simply the experts who claim their expertise as the reason for their power to determine whether or not a conflict is a civil war, which then has enormous consequences in terms of humanitarian aid, the possibilities of external intervention, and sometimes, as for example in the case of the Balkan Wars, for the pursuit of war crimes trials once a conflict has concluded, for instance. So these definitions do have real-world consequences for tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people, and those are usually the most vulnerable in the global community today.
The last question about this book that will be published next year, and we're looking forward to it, is that you do talk somewhere in one of your lectures about Steven Pinker and his claim that now we live in much less violent times. You seem to suggest that that's perhaps because the war between nations is, not as much, but we have more civil wars. So I want to ask you about Steven Pinker, but also reminding ourselves as what Amartya Sen said once, that no two democracy have ever gone to war against each other. How would you characterize our age as a historian in relation to war and violence?
Well, some people have said that what we're experiencing now is a global civil war, which we might unpack a little bit to say the globalization of civil war, or a war within the human community at large, one where borders, national borders, state borders matter less and less, that even those wars that we call still civil wars tend in many cases to be internationalized. That is, they draw in outside forces, outside parties, neighbors in African conflicts, for instance, or you could think about Afghanistan as a civil war which has drawn in the US and other regional powers, for instance. That seems to be part of our world, but also transnational terrorism has been cast by some theorists like Giorgio Agamben and others in a kind of Schmittian vein as a global civil war, and the globalization of violence which used to take place at the state level or between armies, between much more borderless, asymmetrical, much harder to define or to pin down kinds of communities or groups as well. And if we put that in the context of Steve Pinker's thesis, and he's obviously not alone in arguing for the global decline of violence really since the beginnings beginnings of human society, I think we have to say yes. I mean, empirically those arguments are correct in the sense that the so-called long peace, which spread from Northern Europe and North America in the terms of a peace between states, seems to be becoming global, though people in Crimea or the South China Sea might disagree about that this is just a truce within a potentially more warlike interstate world. And then if we also think about Pinker's empirical, that is really almost statistical analyses of violence, a core part of his thesis is that fewer people are dying as a percentage of the world population, or have been dying over the course of the 20th century. Well, one could say in coldly statistical terms that's clearly true, but actually more people have been dying, more than 50 million over the course of the Second World War, more than 25 million in the course of what we call civil wars since the Second World War, than have died at any point in human history before. And I think, honestly, that kind of calculation is morally obtuse. More individuals are dying, more families are being torn apart, more communities have been damaged by those individual and collective deaths than at any point in human history. To say that that's in fact less cumulatively painful because it represents a smaller proportion of the larger human population shows to me a kind of ethical barbarism which I find unacceptable, and I think the families and the friends and relatives of the victims of both civil war and international conflict in the 20th century would similarly find wholly repugnant.
Absolutely. So let's get to your other book. That is an interesting form. If we get that one. So this is the History Manifesto, and we chose to show it on an iPad because even though it was also published as a book, it's available free online. And it was quite a hit. You begin with saying that there is a bonfire of humanity, and somewhere else you speak about history as being embattled, but this, the book in itself seemed to have quite a bonfire effect. Mm-hmm. So what does it the History Manifesto declares? I mean, you like declarations and manifestos clearly. So what is it that you're declaring?
Declares the importance of history in a world condemned to blindness by short-termism of various kinds, whether the short-termism of the electoral cycle or of quarterly reporting among corporations. It urges historians to take back a role that they had historically for generations, even millennia, that is to have a purpose not solely to reconstruct the past, but to reconstruct the past in the present with an eye to the future, to take back that historic role for historians as guides to public life, not only for politicians and those who advise them, but also for citizens themselves, and to make a broader claim, not just for historians in the public sphere, but also for humanists in general, in a world in which certain kinds of social scientists, especially economists, have the ears of governments and civil servants and international organizations, and in which identifiably the humanities are declining in absolute numbers in our classrooms in terms of employment, but also in terms of the public voices that the humanities and humanists in general have in the world. We need to reassert the centrality of our insights before it's too late in relation to highly complex long-term crises such as global governance, inequality and climate change, among many other things.
Yeah, so if I can have that back actually, so I'll go through it to show some of the graphs, but yeah, there are a few things that you do talk about as a result of this short-sightedness. Climate change is one of them. The other one is the inequality, that you try to put it in perspective. The way capitalism is seen as being here, of course, the end of history. Argument by Fukuyama became very famous. But why do you think that historians are not listened to enough now? What do you think are the reasons for that, and how do you think it can be rectified?
Mm-hmm. Well, one reason that we analyze in the book, and this has experienced quite a lot of pushback from fellow historians, is that one of the unintended consequences of what we might call professionalism, that is, an insistence on picking relatively small bounded topics which can be analysed with the full weight of the complex historiography around them, and usually analysed only and specifically in relation to available primary sources, has inevitably led to a shrinking of the timescales, the visions, the frames that historians have put around their subjects. And so historians have been complaining for almost 40 years about more and more historians writing more and more history that fewer and fewer people want to read. I think in many ways that trend has been reversed by both the rise of popular history, often written by non-accredited historians or not by professional historians on the one hand, and then the emergence in various countries of very successful efforts by professional historians to write broader narratives on bigger subjects, addressing more contemporary questions addressed to wider audiences. But there's still a sense in which we, as many professional academics, write more for ourselves than we do for our own students, for their parents, for our families, for those who fund the universities in which we operate, whether through taxpayers or through, in private universities, private donations, for instance. And so we have to be aware of the fact that we are embattled and that we may need to rethink some of the purposes of our historical writing beyond the merely professional, back into a public role to answer big questions which are being answered exclusively by other academics or by non-professional thinkers outside the academic sphere.
No, but let's talk also about global history. So we're all students of global history producing this program. Do you also see global history as a way to counter this perhaps over-specialization?
Yes, absolutely. And if we think of global, not just in spatial terms, but also in temporal terms as well, to think, for instance, about successive waves of interconnection, whether they're transcontinental, transoceanic, or truly planetary in scale, then we have a way of understanding the way in which our own world, or the worlds, the multiple worlds that we inhabit, have emerged, to understand the politics, the economics, the cultural connections and disconnections which inevitably shape the world that we exist in at the moment. To, again, it comes back to some questions of humility, for instance, not assuming that our present dispensations have always been thus or may always have to be as they are now, but they're dynamic, contingent, the result of multiple factors, but also to argue that our present contains many pasts, and out of that may come many futures, and to use that as a means of liberating our imaginations, especially our political imaginations, to deal with what seem to be intractable problems. Again, something like inequality. It's an observable fact that inequality between nations is declining, even as inequality within particular states or nations has been rising in the last generation or so. How to take stock of that problem is a pressing question. Obviously, in Europe and well beyond Europe, questions of migration, mobility, integration, multiculturalism have become forefront issues in contemporary politics across the world. Now, this is not remotely unprecedented. One can go back to the Second World War, one can go back to the late 19th century, one can go back to the 16th century. There are many other periods where similar questions have been faced in different parts of the world. And the wisdom of history, the wisdom of historians, has often been lacking in these contemporary debates. And the argument of the History Manifesto was that at the very least we should bring historians back into those conversations to give them a depth and complexity which sometimes they have been lacking. And a collateral effect of that might be to raise the prominence of history within universities, to bring more students into our classrooms to see history as a practical discipline of great relevance to their contemporary life and how they might shape their lives and those of others in the future, and to return history to the prestige and centrality in public conversation that it's had in most major cultures over at least the last 2,000 years, but seems to have lost to a large extent maybe in the last 50 years or so.
Now you describe yourself as an analog historian in a digital time. This manifesto that I'll show again was published obviously on the internet as well, and it's read, which is a pretty sort of new thing to do. You're also on Twitter. I've seen that you're also active on Twitter, unlike many academics. So you've clearly making the effort there. The question is, how important is digital literacy? Question that was asked by a lot of us before interviewing you today. How important it is, and isn't it too much of a dangerous thing, basically?
Well, I think digital literacy is utterly important. There's a difference, as you'll know from studies of literacy generally, between what we might call passive literacy and functional literacy. So I don't necessarily believe that every historian or every humanist needs to become a digital humanist or a digital historian in the sense that they acquire all of the various tools and capacities that the digital humanities can endow us with. I certainly would not claim that I've done much of that myself. But I think digital literacy, in the very particular sense of understanding where our materials come from, how they've been curated, how they've been archived, edited, reformed, reshaped, communicated to us as scholars and indeed as citizens, is a vital, indeed indispensable part of the training that we give to students in our classrooms, whether undergraduates or graduate students, and also, again, part of our basic civic literacy. So an example I often use is the difference that any of us can get from doing the same Google search at our office computer and our home computer, that you can get very different results according to the past search history on your own computer. Without realizing that, you tend to assume the objectivity of what the algorithm brings to you, but when you begin to learn a little bit about how algorithms produce their results through something as basic as a Google search or something parallel on other search engines, then you begin to be more skeptical about what's being brought before you on the screen. And then when we turn that into an aspect of professional literacy, I see it as the equivalent of the philological bases of the humanities in the 19th and 20th centuries that we've always been taught, and we teach our students to be skeptical of primary sources. What archive did they come from? What were the purposes, political and otherwise, behind the formation of that archive? When we read an edited text that's been handed down to us, what were the procedures? What were the methods? What material has been left out as well as what's been put in? These are basic forms of literacy that we use day in, day out as historians and as humanists in general on printed texts and on manuscripts. But we're not as self-conscious about the digital materials, which for more and more of us provide the very essence, the very subjects and objects on which we work, but we don't handle them with the same care, and we need to be aware of how they're communicated to us, what's been left out as well as what's been put in, how mobile and changeable these digital objects are, in order to be wary and skeptical of what we can actually do with them in the same way that we're wary and skeptical of what we've done with more traditional analog materials as well.
So we've come toward the end of the conversation today, but there is a game that we like to do here. So I would like to, ask you two questions there. As a historian, if you wanted to be a character, or a part of a society in any of the times past, it can be anywhere in the world or anywhere else. Where would it be? Where would have liked to feel how it is like and to live there?
Gosh. I would have liked prior notice of that question to provide
that's what makes it a game.
some time to think about it. Because of my recent interest in the history of international law, I think it would have been exciting to be an international lawyer in the early part of the 19th century, with a self-consciously globalizing world, with the interconnection of different systems of norms, and the attempt as a globe-spanning professional to try to understand that, to gather materials, to be part of the emerging inter-regional conversations about those norms. I think that would have been quite exciting.
So imagine you as a lawyer somewhere between Geneva, London and Boston in the early 19th century.
Or possibly between there and Calcutta and Buenos Aires or the Middle East. I mean, it would be a genuinely global moment, I think, to bring to bear a whole range of different skills and interests. Yes,
absolutely. And the last part of the game is that if you could, sit down, have a cup of tea or any other beverage with a person from history that you've studied. It can be a famous person or a character that you've come upon as your studies. Who that would be?
The character I always think I would most enjoy meeting is David Hume. The character I'd be most interested in meeting, which I think was the one the aim you had there, would probably be Thomas Hobbes, to whom you bear an interesting resemblance physically, I notice. And to ask him in relation to one of my earlier books, why he was seen to be so uninterested in international relations, since he was so interested in the state and political authority. I realise those two characters are very parochial and they both come from Britain in the 17th and 18th centuries, but I know enough about them to know that Hume would be an extremely agreeable companion, not just for a cup of tea, but probably for a glass of Madeira. And Hobbes would be a really challenging interlocutor, and I'd really like to pin him down on some key issues.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry that we can't bring that wish to life today, but thank you very much for joining our conversation. My name is Arash Azizi again for History on Tape in Berlin, and we spoke with Professor David Armitage today. He's the chair of history at Harvard, and we spoke about his book, The Declaration of Independence, A Global History, his upcoming book, Civil Wars, A History in Ideas, and the History Manifesto that he co-wrote with Joe Goldie, and has become an important book in the field. I hope you liked the conversation today. If you'd like to see more of this, please join us on YouTube and suggest which historian or which periods you would like us to talk about. Thank you for watching us today.